Dr. Brenda Guest, and I'm with Allen Temple Baptist Church, the Center for Biblical and Family Studies. And so I just want to welcome you. This is our class, Dancing in the Darkness, with Dr. Reverend Otis Moss III. And so I'm going to take just a moment and introduce him to you. Many of you probably already know him, but just in case you don't, you need to know that the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss is the senior pastor of Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, Illinois. He is a preacher, poet, activist, author, community organizer, scholar, filmmaker, and the founder of the Unashamed Media Group. Dr. Moss was also identified by the Baylor University George W. Truett Theological Seminary as one of the 12 most effective preachers in the English language. He has written numerous books, including the one that we are going to study for the next 4 weeks, and that's Dancing in the Darkness. And so without further ado, your professor, Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III.
Dr. Brenda Guest, thank you so much for that introduction and for this invitation to be with the Allen Temple family. I first want to acknowledge and thank your pastor, Pastor Jacqueline Thompson, who is an absolute gift, one of the best preachers in this country, minister extraordinaire, and she blessed us for our 7 last words during COVID, actually, and sent in an absolutely stellar message that blessed us so deeply. And so I just want to thank her for her witness. Just a wonderful colleague, and I'm just so grateful for her ministry and for her work. And also your Pastor Emeritus, Dr. J. Alfred Smith. We are so appreciative of him. He is a living legend, without a doubt. Dr. Smith, the Smith and Moss family go way back, if I should say that. My grandmother, who was in Vallejo, California, she had to always, at least once a month, make her way over to Allen Temple for the early service to hear Dr. Smith. And so I have fond memories of the Bay Area. And I'm just so grateful that Allen Temple has been so kind to my family, to my grandmother, to my mother, to my father, my sister when she was living, my brother. We are just very grateful for your love. And of course, all my cousins and my auntie and my uncle, they are all out in that area. So I'm looking forward to checking in. I don't know if my cousin Dee Dee is on here or not, but I have to give Dee Dee and Derek a shout out, along with Aunt Bev and Uncle Velman and Uncle Ron, who are out there in the Bay Area, and we're just really appreciative of all that Allen Temple means to all of us. I want to begin for us tonight as we look at this theme of dancing in the darkness. If you have a copy of the book, I'm going to be dealing with some of the things that are in the book, but also the resources and influences that inspired the writing of this particular book. And Dancing in the Darkness comes out of a long-term project, a long-term, I would say, spiritual itch to be able to talk about the essence of Black spirituality, the essence of Black spirituality. So what does that mean, Black spirituality? Let's start with some general definitions and understanding. When we talk about religion, we're talking about very specific system. When we talk about spirituality, we're talking about integrative ideas that make up the entire person, meaning your mind, your body, and your spirit, and those values. And Black people, we have a very specific spirituality. We have a specific theology. We have a specific way in which we engage our religious tradition that is drawn from West Africa, that recognizes one, here are the tenets of Black spirituality. One is that God is sovereign. Two, that there is no separation between sacred and secular. Now that may sound strange to some who've been highly influenced by Western thought. Now, the Western idea of sacred and secular separation really comes out of what is known as the French Revolution, and what became known in the West as the Enlightenment movement. But when you talk about people of African descent, we say that there's no sacred and secular separation. Why do we say that? We believe that God is sovereign, that God operates everywhere, is loose in the world, and doesn't consult us in terms of how God is going to do God's things. And when you have sacred and secular separation, it allows you to create, design ideologies that are destructive to the human personality. It allows you to design ideologies that are destructive to the human personality. Prime example, for people of African descent who were enslaved, not slaves, but enslaved, because we didn't start from slavery and move to freedom. In the words of poet Askia Touré, some of us, when we went from pyramids to projects, we went from freedom to slavery and then emancipation. So we didn't start out as slaves. But in the enslavement period, the sacred and secular separation allowed people of European descent to justify dehumanizing people of African descent. How does that work? Well, if there's sacred and secular separation, I can worship God on Sunday and I can hold you as a slave on Monday, because my connection, my spiritual connections, my religion has nothing to do with Monday through Saturday. I would even go so far as stating that the American project, this is not a Christian nation, but a nation that is capitalist, that wears Christian garments. Let me say it again. It's capitalist that wears Christian garments. So when you hear people talking about Christian nationalism, they are actually talking about a combination of capitalism and white supremacy wearing ecclesiastical garments. It may have religious language, but at the heart, it has nothing to do with the message and teachings of Jesus Christ. And so within the American project, there was a sacred and secular separation. I can hold you as a slave because there is sacred and secular separation. I don't have to bring my faith into my relationship with you. Well, Black people, God's sovereign, and there's no sacred and secular separation. We believe that God, wherever you do, the embodiment, the action, the way you live, whatever you're doing on Monday connects with what is happening on Sunday. What happens on Saturday connects with what happens on Sunday. It is all completely integrated. Let me give you a story It's one of my favorite stories to share with you how I stumbled on this idea once I reflected on it years later. When I was much younger, I was a part of a group called Jack and Jill. Didn't want to be a part of it, but mom made me to go. The only reason I was really a part of it because there was a girl I thought was really cute to be a part of Jack and Jill. And Jack and Jill had an outing at a place called the Front Row in Cleveland, Ohio. And it was one of these theaters in the round, it would spin around. The whole thing would spin around. And no matter where you were like in the front row. So there was an outing that we were to go to a concert at the front row. And I was just going because there's a girl I thought was really cute who was there. I had no interest. I was a hip hop head. They weren't going to see any hip hop. There was no Rakim. I didn't want to go. It was DeBarge and Luther Vandross. Now, I had no interest. I didn't have any interest in Luther, didn't have any interest in DeBarge. I had interest in Rakim. But there was a young lady who I thought was cute. I want to go. And so here I go to the front row. DeBarge, they do their thing. I like it, all that good stuff. And then Luther comes on. I was not, I didn't know much about Luther. My godparents listened to Luther. My mom and dad, my sister listened to Luther. I really didn't listen to Luther. I was a hip hop head, golden age of hip hop, I might add. And so Luther comes out. Luther begins to sing a song. Some of you know, a house is not a home. A chair is just a chair. He was killing it. I was blown away. But what was amazing, here we were, this little group of young people. There was a lady in the third row, and she was shouting up a storm like it was church. Then I looked closer, and I realized she goes to my church. She shouts the same way on Sunday, but she was shouting for Luther on Saturday the same way she shouted for Jesus on Sunday. That always stuck in my mind. And then I realized that for people of African descent, we know that the spirit is Luther. She wasn't shouting for Luther as if Luther was her savior. But when Luther did that, no, you know how he does those no runs. There was something in that sound of what Luther was doing and his mastery of what he was doing, that it spoke to her at a deep level. And for Black people, that happens. Let me give you another example. When Black people, there's no sacred and secular. Anyone who has ever been to an HBCU graduation, we all know that an HBCU graduation will start out with pomp and circumstance and will end out as a Pentecostal revival meeting. There will always be the dean of students will stand up there at some point and say, please hold your applause until the entire class of 2024 receives their degrees. And they will tell you, let the entire class walk across the stage so that they'll give all these announcements. But they fail to realize every year at every HBCU across the nation, Big Mama shows up. And when her child walks across the stage, she will shout. And at that moment, everything moves from European pomp and circumstance to a Pentecostal revival meeting. I don't need to be in church in order to recognize the movement, the beauty, the power of God. It happened at the moment that my child walked across the stage, and I know all of the time that I have invested praying and working to see this accomplishment. No separation between sacred and secular. The other aspect, God is sovereign, no separation of sacred and secular. But then also the recognition that God is, in the words of James Cone and also Howard Thurman, on the side of the oppressed for those who have their backs against the wall. And those are just three aspects of Black spirituality. And then just to add a fourth would be the fundamental belief in the possession of the Spirit, that the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, is loose in the world. And the Holy Spirit can possess the tenor sound of a Marvin Gaye, or the beautiful runs and standards of a Mahalia Jackson. We operate the same way, recognizing that the Spirit is loose. The Spirit can be loose in such a way at a protest or in a Pentecostal church. The Spirit is absolutely loose, and we can be possessed by the Spirit. The idea of Black spirituality, and there are several books that speak to what Black people have brought to these United States. I want to begin first by mentioning a poem by a woman by the name of Anita Scott Coleman. She was an Afro-Mexican who moved from Mexico, then to New Mexico, and then eventually was a part of the Harlem Renaissance. She was a colleague of a person many people on this webinar have heard of, a person by the name of Langston Hughes. And she has a poem entitled Portraiture. And I changed just simply one word for modern audience, but she was talking about the power and spirituality of Black people. And the poem goes this way. Black people are the tall trees that remain standing in a forest after a fire. Flames strip their branches. Flame sears their limbs. Flames scorch their trunks, yet stand these trees, for their roots are thrust deep in the earth. Black people are the tall trees that remain standing in a forest after a fire. Anita Scott Coleman, Portraiture. She's speaking about the power and spirituality that flows out of the Black tradition. There's currently a book that can be purchased today by a scholar by the name of Gary Doran, who has written an extraordinary book, two volumes actually. One is called The New Abolition, W.E.B. Du Bois and the Black Social Gospel. And volume 2 is entitled Breaking White Supremacy. And there's a third volume to that one. I'm trying to remember the third volume to it. But those first two, what Gary Doran says is that Black people, our theology, the way that we practice Christianity, our view of Christianity, it is not the same as the faith tradition of those who were the enslaver. He says, unfortunately, many in the scholarly realm have lifted up a person by the name of Walter Rauschenbusch and talked about the social gospel. It is Gary Doran who says Black people have practiced a Black social gospel, not borrowed from Walter Rauschenbusch. There's now scholarship to say that Rauschenbusch actually got it from a socialist pastor named Reverend Reddy Ransom, who was a part of the AME Church, I believe, during the period of post Reconstruction. And we have had a theology, a practice that said God is focused on those who are vulnerable, that God is sovereign, and that there is no separation between sacred and secular. So whether I am organizing with unions in reference to labor or women's suffrage, or looking at the building of an HBCU, all of that is connected to my relationship with God. The Black social gospel sees every human being through the eyes of what is known as the Imago Dei, that we are all children of the Most High God. Howard Thurman says it best when he says that something revolutionary happens. And I paraphrase a little bit of what Thurman says, but something revolutionary happens when enslaved people found out and understood that they were loved by God and they loved themselves. There was no chain on earth or demon in hell that could hold us back from wanting to be free and to alter, change, and transform our condition, but more importantly, the condition for our children's children's children. That became the project of the Black social gospel. It's not about what I do. It's about what we do for generations that are yet to be born. And so the book, Dancing in the Darkness, is a small slice of Black spirituality that brings together our West African roots. This is the basis of where this book comes from. Brings together our West African roots, along with the uniqueness of not only our practice of the Christian faith, but our reclamation of the Christian faith. It's interesting that prior to the post-Reconstruction period, most Black churches, whether you were Baptist, whether you were AME, whatever, those churches were called, they were African Baptist, just like they were African Methodist. And many through the South were Ethiopian. That was the term that we would use, Ethiopian Baptists. We have one that still stands today in New York City, the Abyssinia Baptist Church. Abyssinia is another word for Ethiopia, founded by Ethiopians, Abyssinia Baptist Church. We recognized that the faith of the enslaver was not the faith of Jesus. The faith of the enslaver was not the faith that we practiced. That's the beauty of what Frederick Douglass, who was a practitioner of what we would call the Black social gospel, who recognized this reclamation in terms of how we practice, is that he was very clear, especially in his July 4th speech, when he talked about that the faith that you practice, I recognize no Jesus whatsoever. That all of the words that you offer are just clanging cymbals and loud noises. It has nothing to do with the rooting of a man in what we would call today Palestine, this Jewish man of dark complexion who has African roots. Frederick Douglass was making these critiques back then. That is our tradition. That is our faith. Dancing in the Darkness is my attempt to get at the root, and not just to get at the root. It's not an academic piece, but in terms of get at the rooting of the idea of Black spirituality. And also recognizing that as Black people in the United States and how we practice and the way we view Jesus, that we are 100 years ahead of the rest of the country when it comes to understanding the idea of diversity. Yes, we are 100, because as people of African descent in the United States, we understand that the connectivity between a variety of cultures. For example, for those who have roots in New Orleans, the term Creole, and just about every Black person is Creole in some form or fashion, meaning that we have in our lineage, indigenous, Native American. In our lineage, we find out that we have people who speak Spanish. In our lineage, we have those who are part of Europe. We are not one or the other. In our lineage, we have people who speak Arabic and Yoruba and Spanish and French and Creole, the whole nine. And in our cultural practices, we bring together a variety of cultures. One of the best examples is a song that everyone has probably heard of by the name of Amazing Grace. Amazing Grace is the most well-known American hymn, probably across what was considered to be the New World, whether in Canada or the United States and in Great Britain. But Amazing Grace is a peculiar song. It was written by a gentleman, last name Newton, who was at one time a peddler in black flesh. He was a person who would capture and sell people of African descent. And the story that is told about this gentleman, Newton, is that he had a transformative experience, and the song Amazing Grace was written when he had an experience on the sea. Now, what is interesting about Amazing Grace is that if you were to go to the Library of Congress, according to ethnomusicologist by the name of Whitney Phipps, he said that you will see that Amazing Grace is written by Newton, but it will then also say written by Newton, but melody unknown. Because Amazing Grace is different from every other hymn in the hymn book. European hymn books have usually the beats are on 1 and 3, not 2 and 4, a lot of them, but also they are out of the European framework of musical structure. Amazing Grace is structured on an African rhythm and chord structure that are known as pentatonic. Pentatonic just means just five, just basically five notes. The pentatonic scale is the scale that is used in every single spiritual. The pentatonic scale is used in every work song. The pentatonic scale is also found in, what do you know? Blues music, and also found in what? Gospel music. So the pentatonic scale is found in Amazing Grace. How did that happen? Well, there's one story that says that Newton was on a ship, and he had some of us in the hull of the ship, and a storm came, and he started praying, and the storm ceased, and that's where the words "saved a wretch like me" came from. That's the European side. But there's another story told from mouth to ear in places like Sapelo Island off the coast of Georgia, St. John's and Defusky in South Carolina, and told in these small southern towns like Itabena, Mississippi, and other places like Monticello, Mississippi, down right outside of Birmingham in Bessemer, Alabama, and over in places like Augusta, Georgia. These stories are told a little bit different. The story is, yeah, Newton was he was on top of the ship, but there were some people in the hull of the ship, and they were humming and moaning when the ship came upon rough seas. And the hum and the moan was so beautiful that it made its way up to heaven as a sweet aroma. And an angel got a whiff and ran over to God and said, God, you've got to hear your children sing. They're doing something down there. And God came down from God's throne and bent over the banister of heaven and told everybody in heaven and all creation to shh, want to hear my children sing. And that's when the storm ceased. The storm ceased because of the sound of Black people who, though they were speaking different languages, they all had the same collective sound, and they were offering a prayer unto God, and God heard that prayer and the music ceased. What is amazing about Amazing Grace, because it's a pentatonic hymn, that means African chord structure and African rhythm in its structure, is that in order to play Amazing Grace, you have to have Black keys. If you don't have any Black keys to play it, guess what? You'll have grace, but it won't be amazing. That's the beauty of what we bring to the table. We bring something unique. When it comes to the spiritual experience, the religious experience, if you go from 1619 to today, and you look at those who have been involved in the transformation of this democratic project, people of faith, they are not prosperity preachers. They are not prosperity practitioners. That's capitalism. But when you talk to a Fannie Lou Hamer, and you talk to a Maria Wright Stewart or Ann Julian Cooper, that is out of the Black social gospel, or what I like to say, that's Black spirituality. Mind, body, and spirit working congruently, recognizing that God is sovereign. There is no sacred and secular separation, and that how everything that I do is given to God and honors God. So when I organize the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, Fannie Lou Hamer, as she says, I'm worshiping. When I'm organizing the NAACP, Medgar Evers in Mississippi, I'm worshiping. Or Dorothy Height, when I'm organizing women, Black women, I'm worshiping. And to add a story about the beauty of Dorothy Height is that Dorothy Height, and I will never forget, I don't know if Dr. Smith is on this webinar right now. He probably knows the story. I'll never forget that I was at the Hampton Ministers Conference and Dorothy Height was giving remarks, just giving remarks because she was present. There was actually a conference in Hampton that she was also present. She came by, the president of Hampton offered her, please give remarks. And as she stood before over 6,000 ministers, I will never forget, she will say, and she must have been about 91 at the time, she says, when I was 18, I believed I was called to preach. When I told my pastor I had been called to preach, he told me women aren't called to preach. And then she paused for a moment and she said, it's interesting. God gave me a larger pulpit than the man who shut the door in my face to preach. That I was not called to preach in that town. I've been called to preach across the globe for the transformation and liberation of Black people. Her faith, her spirituality, she believed that voting rights was a part of the work. That's when I say Black spirituality. That's what it means. It's not just Sunday work. It's not just repeating scripture. It is embodiment. It's a key phrase, embodiment. So the white evangelical perspective is not about embodiment. It is about expansion of the kingdom, or a better phrase, expansion of the empire. The Black tradition of Black spirituality, the prophetic wing that is, has been about embodiment. How do I live in such a way that God is glorified and people will inquire of me, who is this God I serve? This is as close to the early Christian tradition as one can move. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the Coptic Church, the Armenian Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, all of the early churches that are not a part of the Roman Catholic tradition, all of these early traditions believed in embodiment because they looked at the message and the work of Jesus Christ. And Jesus was a person who was teaching embodiment. What does that mean, if I may push this argument further? It means that when I heal someone, I don't heal them so they join my synagogue. I heal them because it's the right thing to do, and because they are a child of God. So if I heal 10 lepers, 9 of them may never come back, but one, a tithe, may come back and say thank you. Jesus never demands that now you must say, I'm your Lord and Savior. He heals anyhow, whether it's a Syrophoenician woman or whether he is having a conversation with a Roman soldier, or if he's with a man in the tombs who is living around the Roman-controlled area known as Decapolis. Or it is a woman at the well who moves into Samaria. The African roots of Christianity and the manner in which Black people in America have practiced, which we could go into a whole thing in reference to African roots and the practices of people of African descent, that there's new information now. I'm really excited to be able to share this. That do you know that the first 20 odd or so Africans who came to America, who came from the Congo, one were Christian, had been practicing the faith for their community and practicing the faith for about 150 years before any of the colonists. A letter even came from the Roman Catholic Church asking the colonists to free the first Black people who arrived, because they were some of the most devout practitioners of the faith, and there was much to learn from them. But we're not told that. We're not told that. We're told it's a white man's religion, when in actuality it is a faith tradition that has African roots. And our ancestors in the Black social gospel has been reclaiming that. So Dancing in the Dark is drawn from that tradition, a tradition that speaks about the idea of embodiment. And the main framing of the book, and the huge influences, really two huge influences, two individuals, and then the tradition that I'm speaking of. One is Howard Thurman, who we will discuss in a later session. And another is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. They haunt the entire book. And Dr. King's idea of what it means to have a complete life, a life that is not just political, not just social, not just economic, but a life also that is rooted spiritually, to have a complete life. And Dancing in the Darkness is about this idea of having a complete life, this idea of living that particular complete life, which is a beautiful, beautiful thing to be able to do. And the book is, again, my attempt to bring forth the spiritual lessons that are deeply dipped and have the residue of the sacredness of our tradition. There's an intentionality in my writing that I wanted to elevate and lift up the Black spiritual tradition, but also Black scholarship and the examples, because I believe historical examples of people who inform us theologically. One being my father and mother, sister, who informed me theologically, August Wilson, Zora Neale Hurston, Howard Thurman, who I mentioned, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Benjamin Elijah Mays, Fannie Lou Hamer, and many others. They serve as the root that speak to the idea of Black spirituality. So that is the impetus of the book. It started long ago. These ideas ruminated. I'm still not done. I've got a couple of other pieces that I'm working on. One being the jazz of our democracy, which will lift up different Black figures and lay out how they contributed to the democratic project through their practice of embodiment and resilience. The other piece we mentioned about the complete life that Dr. King talks about. But the book, there's another through line in the book. There's Dr. King. We'll get into to talk about Howard Thurman later, but it is the through line of a particular spiritual principle: spiritual resilience. Spiritual resilience. If anybody knows about resilience, it's Black people. Let me share something that Black people did that many people do not know, but is being studied academically across the globe. When 4 million Black people were emancipated, 1865, the majority of Black people could not read, did not have access to education, did not have access to any form of wealth, did not own land. You go from 1865 to roughly, I think it's about around 1917 or so, which is the beginning, still in the middle of the kind of the backlash of the post-Reconstruction era. You had the greatest move of human beings in probably human history. What do you mean, greatest move? Black people went from an almost 85% illiteracy rate to shifting over to a 70% literacy rate. Black people went from no institutions of higher learning and schools and all these things to every place in the South. A total of somewhere close back then, it was probably 138, I believe, somewhere between there, about 125, 138, just institutions of higher learning. Black people, 60 years after the enslavement period, had more acres of land ownership than they do in 2024. We were poised to be the class and group of people who literally fed the nation, the Black farmer. You must understand that when we were emancipated, people who had the skill and the innovation for farming were Black people. All of that was absolutely decimated. So when we talk about the Red Summer, we talk about what happened in Oklahoma and the destruction of of Black Wall Street, and there were many Black Wall Streets. There wasn't just one. In every state and around every Black community, there was a Black Wall Street. We moved economically, socially, and educationally. There's never been a group of people in the history of the Western world that have ever done what Black people did. From the moment we were emancipated, we got to working and said that we're going to make something better for our grandchildren. There is no record of any other people ever doing this in Western history. And as I could, I think, say with some positivity and affirmation, that it's never been done. There's no record in human history of this. It's extraordinary that we did this. Unbelievable. And the idea of resilience is not just bouncing back, but resilience means that when you are going through, matter of fact, I think there's a blues song that helps us understand resilience. When you're going through hell, don't stop. When you're catching hell, don't hold it. And that's what Black people did. When we were going through hell, we're not going to stop. When we catching hell, I'm sure not going to hold it. We practiced that kind of resilience rooted within the spirituality that was mind, body, and spirit, where we believed that we wanted to embody the message and teachings of Jesus Christ. We had a prophetic wing of our tradition, and that prophetic wing was the wing that was vocal about the transformation of this very young democratic experiment of what W.E.B. Du Bois calls the yet-to-be United States of America. That is the through line in Dancing in the Darkness. So there's one thing that you could pick up is that we're dealing with Black spirituality. We recognize that God is sovereign, that there's no sacred and secular separation, that God is on the side of those who are vulnerable, the oppressed, for those who have their backs against the wall, and the spirit is loose. And the spirit does not possess, hold, direct, push people who only claim to be Christian. God can do whatever God wants to do with whoever God wants to do whatever God wants to do, period. And that was a fundamental belief within the project of Black people early on. They say that, yeah, the spirit is on that child. Now, he doesn't even know it. That was the spirit doing that. I mean, some of you who have people in with Southern roots, you hear that language that, yeah, listen, that was the spirit right now. They don't even have any know. They didn't even know what was happening. But the spirit is loose. That is part of our resilience. And this resilience is something that we have to teach to this generation. Power of resilience, because we are now in one of the most dangerous moments in human history, more dangerous than the nuclear age. I just saw an article that was in the New Yorker. We have moved from capitalism with an oligarchy to what is called a new economy called techno-feudalism, where there are very few people who literally control how people feel and what they think. There's only a few companies that control social media. They have extraordinary influence and power. And we have seen what that can do to a democracy. I don't want to mention the person's name because it kind of gives me a headache. But we now have someone who was in the White House, who's poised possibly to be back in the White House. And one of the number one reasons is because of techno-feudalism. We allow misinformation to function because Congress and the Senate are so behind. They don't even understand technology. The Supreme Court is in the back pocket. Well, a few people. I'm a big big fan of Kataji Brown Jackson. That's one of that sister is just bad. I just have to put that out there. And we are witnessing what a few people who are in power do. And we are witnessing the amassing of wealth in the hands of a very few. Billionaires. They can't spend their wealth in their lifetime. Their children cannot spend their wealth in their lifetime. Their grandchildren can't spend their wealth in their lifetime. That billionaires, based on their interest, we're talking about people who make $8 million a minute if their money's just sitting somewhere. $8 million a minute. That's the kind of wealth that we're talking about. And their influence on our democracy and our world is unlike we've ever seen before. This is different from the Carnegies and the robber barons. This is radically different from when we created laws in reference to monopolies, and we created federal communications commissions, and we created the SEC, all of this to protect people. We don't have laws in place at all to deal with the rise of this new economy of techno-feudalism. And guess what? We are the serfs under techno-feudal lords because we don't understand the economy the way it functions now. We still talk, we're analog people arguing with digital individuals. We're seeking to replace us with AI. This is the challenge, and this is why we need even more so the teaching of the Black social gospel rooted in the message and teaching of Jesus Christ. Why we need even more to understand Black spirituality and resilience and how we will engage these troubling and challenging moments in our society, a society that is not capitalist, but is a techno-feudal society that will forever reshape will forever reshape how we see our history and how we see our future. And the church, whew, the church is just far behind in understanding this. But we can gain a greater understanding simply by taking hold of the message of Christ in a very different way. Not the white evangelical nationalist conservative just make it personal, this, that, and the other. But I'm talking about the way that our ancestors, they saw this. They understood what was coming. So the book, Spiritual Lessons for Thriving in Turbulent Times, is designed to give us the virtues, values, and principles to be resilient in the face of difficulty. That's all I want to be able to do. And share stories, because I firmly believe that stories are transformative. You can give people statistics all day long, but it's stories that change your life. And I learned that listening to our sisters and brothers who come out of recovery. And they stated that when I accepted that I was an addict and I changed my story, I changed my life. And that's what those of us who are people of faith, we change our story. We accept Christ, that's the story change. We live our life in a particular way. When you get married, you've got a new story. When you have children, you have a different story. It changes your life. It's the story we tell ourselves will determine our resilience. That's why I'm a fan of a ball player named Kobe Bryant in terms of the way he played. He did not have the physical gifts of other basketball players, like a Michael Jordan. He told himself over and over again, I've got to, if everybody else gets in the gym at 7, I've got to get in the gym at 5. I got to keep working. I got to tell myself I'm going to be the greatest. I've got to tell myself a different story so I can change my life. And that is what is the fundamental battle today is the techno-feudal lords are telling us a particular story about who we are. In this nation, during this, how should I say? Well, during this election, some people will hear one particular story, other people will hear another story. But the ones I'm concerned about, Black children, they need to hear the right story. They need to know that Black people are the tall trees that remain standing in a forest after a fire. Flame strips their branches, flame scorches their limbs, flame sears their trunks, yet stand these trees. Their roots are thrust deep in the earth. Black people are the tall trees that remain standing in a forest after a fire. May God bless you and may God keep you. I want to take some time that we might open up for a little Q&A, and I may be able to clarify some things or whatever questions you may have. I will be honored to do my best to answer one of those questions. But I thank you, my Allen family. You all know I love Allen Temple. It's meant so much to me. The community of Allen Temple has meant so much to me and my family, and to have the opportunity, whether physically or digitally, to be in the presence of Pastor Thompson and the ministry of Dr. Smith and all of those who have been such a blessing in my life, who are from Allen, is truly a deep honor, and I thank you. I thank you. Dr. Brenda, you still out there?
I most certainly am. Oh, thank you so much for enlightening us with your lecture this evening. And so I'm just excited, waiting to hear even more.
Oh, I see Dr. B Squared has a question. Thank you, Dr. B Squared. Dr. B Squared, Dr. Brenda, she just retired from Chicago State University, and I use her work. She is a scholar on a phenomenal person I use in preaching class by the name of Barbara Jordan. She's a Barbara Jordan scholar, and so we just really appreciate you. Thank you. Thank you so much for being on. Now, there's a section for those of you who may be digitally challenged down at the bottom. It says Q&A, and you click on that right there, and you type in your question if you have a question. I don't have any questions.
This is the quiet group. No questions yet.
Well, Dr. Brenda, you have any questions? So we'll start that way. If you for this Q&A for everybody, maybe there's a question or clarification. Here we get. What is the most important offering for us to focus on to aid our nation? From Cheryl Lynn. That's a good question. What is the most important offering? I guess it depends upon your framing. For those who are educators, they would say education. for those who are in politics, or would say politics. I think that the most important offering would be what would be termed as holistic, meaning it is spiritual, it is educational, it is political, it is economic, it is in terms of health, of taking care of our bodies and educating ourselves on that level. There is no one approach. This is all hands on deck approach. If you're an architect, we need your architectural vision to be able to build buildings for those who are unhoused and spaces that people can come into where they can feel fully human. If you are an a doctor, we need you to help us in reference to health disparities and creating a vision around that. If you are an educator, we need early childhood educators. We need people in higher education. We need folk working with middle schools. We need people dealing with elder care and continuing education, people who are not going to go to college, but are going to move into unions and individuals who are going to run those unions and be head of whatever union number, whatever it may be in the Oakland and in the Bay Area. It's a holistic approach. And there is no, we shouldn't have a hierarchy. I love the way that Dean John Kinney says it from the Sam DeWitt Proctor School of Theology, Virginia Union. He says, the West places God up here and then certain people below God, and so on and so on and so on. He said it's a hierarchy. He said the way it should be, God should be at the center, like a solar system, and we should all circle around God, caught in the gravity of God. Because he says, and I love it when it dawned on me what he was saying, that in space there is no up or down, there is no hierarchy. He said, you just circling around the sun. And so we need a theology where we circle around the sun instead of saying, I'm better than you, I'm closer to the sun than you are. No, we just all caught. We're all in the same solar system, circling around the same powerful light. Dr. Benita said, thank you so much for the history reminders and definitions that you brought back to focus. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Brenda Dixon, not quiet, but this was, thank you, Dr. Brenda. Will there be a transcript of this session? Dr. Brenda, I'm not sure. Is there going to be a transcript?
I will have to check with our communications and see if we can provide a transcript.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
So Linda Wallace Brown raised the question. So powerful. Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful. What recommendations would you make to the church? Technology, AI. Well, one, you have it here. You have a digital pastor is one aspect. The other thing is we did something a while back, and actually we picked this up from Lance Watson in Virginia, is to do tech training, youth and seniors. We would have our high school students, our confirmation students, our college students sit down with elders to talk about technology and technological changes. The other, I think, is to have the leadership of a church to be educated in the use of technology. Let me give a prime example. One of the things that COVID helped many churches do is that churches were online and made the shift. Alan Tipple, you all were already online and whatnot. But the way in which we have done broadcast streaming has been problematic. And the reason I say problematic is that we have functioned, not so much now, but we have functioned, and many churches still do, as if those who are live are primary and those who are online are tertiary, that they're not as important. We're just kind of just doing this so you can see what we're doing. And what churches would do, and some of you are going to laugh when I say this because you'll know exactly what happens. You'll tune into a church and they'll have a shot of the entire church. You know, you can see people walking around, going to the bathroom, all you know, all the kind of stuff. And the pulpit looks real tiny. And they're like, we're online. I said, but wait a minute. That in itself is something that we shouldn't be doing anymore. Reason being, when you go to the movies, and the reason I'm speaking about this is because I got a cinematography background. And you go to the movies and you have something called the establishing shot that tells you, hey, I'm in Oakland. But you don't want to see the whole movie from the establishing shot from a distance. You want some close-ups because close-ups create intimacy. And you want to see things from different angles and all of that. Churches have to do the same thing with the expectation that the online audience is just as important as those who are present. Because there are people who can never get out of their house. There are people who are homebound, and we've got technology that allows them to connect. And then we need to create and craft like we're on right now, the kind of Bible study and shows and education material that allows people to connect. And that's really what most people want to do. They want to connect. And we have to create spaces where people can connect. And we have to use the cinematic language to connect with people. The cinematic language for technology. We have an anonymous attendee, and I'm going to answer it even though it's anonymous, and an anonymous usually doesn't want to answer anonymous questions. But what is the function of holiness in Black spirituality? If I'm hearing the question correctly, there was and is a tradition that comes out of after emancipation known as the holiness movement, which is different from Pentecostalism. I want to be clear. There's Pentecostal, there's holiness, there are different variations. And the holiness movement comes out of a protective stance of how we can keep the infringement of the world at bay. So we dress like this, and there's very much we sing this, we do this. There's very much in terms of how we will live and operate. It is one of the streams. Is one of the streams in which we function in. But it's very important to understand how it comes to be, that we are also coming out of a system that infringed on Black people. And holiness was a way of how do we protect ourselves? Well, we protect ourselves by protecting ourselves from this culture that has always attacked Black people. So, you know, don't wear no pants, sisters. Always wear a suit, brothers. You know, this world is dangerous, and it comes out of this idea that there's danger for people of African descent. Please share more about your perspective on how to counter techno-feudalism. You know, the first thing is the education. I'm trying to get through a book right now called Surveillance Capitalism. The fact that I have a phone, I'm pretty sure everybody here has a phone, that we are so far behind in terms of our laws around technology. We are functioning, and even the Supreme Court, the way they function is, I listen to this. I'm a real nerd around certain things, so I'm listening to the Supreme Court when they're doing their oral arguments, and I'm like, these guys, and I'm very specific. I said guys. These guys don't get it. They don't understand anything about technology. They don't understand anything about medicine. That's a whole nother thing with the recent arguments that were happening. But we have to educate ourselves, number one. With a phone, with anything with technology, we give our information freely. And then these companies hold that information. The story of Henrietta Lacks and the use of her cells should be the framing of how we understand technology. Henrietta Lacks, and when she passed away, the company kept her cells. Those cells kept dividing and growing. They ended up making tons of money off of that. It wasn't theirs in the first place. But what corporations have done, they have created a system where our information, our data is owned by them. I mean, you have these little things that come up. Do you want cookies on your phone, do you want to accept cookies or not? We actually have to have laws in place where you cannot own someone's data, number one. We have to have laws in place that makes it very clear that when you purchase something, that I can opt out and everything will still function of you taking my data. We have to understand that anything on the internet, no matter how you think you in private mode, everything is recorded. Everything. I'm sorry, y'all. Everything. Our phone calls can be even without our knowledge. So the first thing is educate ourselves, and the second is we have to know that our legislators do not have they don't have the capacity because to truly understand the tech, and we have to use some of the specialists in the tech, tech educators to help us craft the policy that will protect us. Please speak to Christianity before American slavery. 1619, absolutely. So let's talk about the fact that let me back up a little bit. I was in Israel and Palestine up until October 6th. When I was in Palestine and Israel, there was something very fascinating that I found out. One, there's a whole lot of there's the funny thing while I was there, people were always wondering if I were one of three people. They would want to know, are you Ethiopian? Are you Egyptian? Are you Palestinian? Ain't nobody think I was American until I opened my mouth. They assume it's, you from the US. But the reality is this simple idea, is that the Christian tradition is an African tradition. From Genesis to Revelation, biblically, we can look at that. The oldest continuing Christian tradition is Ethiopia. When Mary and Joseph were told by God, hey, I need you to hide Jesus, he says, go to Africa. Now, Egypt is in Africa, y'all. And I love to say to the church here in Trinity, I say that if you want to hide somebody Black, come to the South Side. If you can go to the suburbs, they're going to find you. So God is saying, hide my child around people who look just like him. But the Christian tradition is African in its roots. And we think of the Roman Catholic tradition as the eldest tradition. It's not. It's the Ethiopian, it's the Coptic, that's Egyptian, it's the Armenian, it's the Greek Orthodox. And they don't have popes, and they don't recognize the Pope. And before that, the Ethiopians were Jewish, long Jewish tradition. And you can just go to the book of Acts, the 8th chapter, and see an Ethiopian eunuch who was encountering one of the apostles, but was reading the book of Isaiah because he was Jewish and he was coming from Jerusalem. And so the early churches were in Africa, and many of these early church people traveled across the Great Sea, known as the Sahara, made their way into places that we know as what? West Africa. just as in the Congo, you had people who have been practicing the tradition since the late 1400s. Just in the Congo, just to name one. There was a large movement of the the diaspora and the dispersing of the Jewish community as a result of Rome dispersing people. They went all, they were black, and many of these black people returned home. And in returning home, some went to Ethiopia, some went to Kenya, some traveled across the Great Sea, ended up landing and resting in places like Ghana and Nigeria and other places. How do we know this? Because now we know that the languages of some of our West African brothers have roots in or connections in with Ethiopia and with what is Hebrew. The ancient Ethiopian language of Ge'ez, Arabic, and Hebrew are Semitic languages. They are all related to each other. And so these languages end up appearing all across the continent. Now, that doesn't happen in Europe. That happens in Africa, which means that we had been sharing information and ideas for thousands of years. It's nothing new. And if we were in the ancient period, the early African tradition of the churches was normal. For example, Saint Augustine is African. Yeah, he African, born in Africa. The translation of the Latin Bible, Septuagint, was done by a group of Africans in North Africa. The idea of what we know as the Trinity comes from Africans. The Council of Nicaea was a gathering mostly, guess what, of an council of African ecclesiastical leaders that were deciding on, what day are we going to, do this on, and what are some of the doctrines of the faith. All of the early portions of the Christian tradition, so much of it is rooted in Africa and what we would call the Asiatic community. It's not Europe. Europe comes later. I mean, it's just true. And here's the interesting thing. The image of Jesus, even in Europe and in the ancient tradition, not until Rome and Constantine specifically, when they take over, the images of Jesus change from black to white. So if you go to Poland and if you go to other places in Russia, they don't have problems with a black Jesus. It's fascinating to me. I had an evangelical runs up on me. He said, you always think that color is a big issue for you. It doesn't matter what color Jesus is. And I looked at him and I said, you're right. It doesn't make a difference what color Jesus is. But here's this. This is what I want you to do. Since the color of Jesus doesn't matter, put a black Jesus in your church and let's see how long you stay as pastor. And the conversation ended at that moment because it does matter, because white supremacy still functions. If it didn't matter, then you wouldn't be raising the question about if I have a black Jesus in my church. It's a very fascinating thing. If it really doesn't matter to you, then those who, in the words of Ta-Nehisi Coates, who believe that they're white, you could put up a black Jesus and it wouldn't bother you one bit. But all of a sudden you become colorblind when black people begin to talk empowerment. All right. How do we begin to engage and teach our young people on black spirituality? Ooh, great question. Reverend Elaine, thank you very much. One of the things we begin to teach our history, but we also have to have the practices. That means everything from prayer and meditation and quiet time, and not the expectation that if I drag my kids to church, that stuff is going to happen by osmosis. Black spirituality means that we recognize the sovereignty of God in every aspect of our being and what we do, which means from when I eat my food to when I go for a run to when I'm going bowling to playing basketball. How do we integrate the idea that this is God's world? And part of the challenge for a modern world, for a modern world. You know, our ancestors in the South and in rural areas, this was easy for them because they were living in a world where creation was dominant. We live in a world where man-made finite things are dominant. Our attention is drawn to man-made buildings and roads and cars and planes and clothes, where the person who was in the Delta in Mississippi looked out on the field and said, you know what? I can plant a seed, but I don't make seeds grow. Isn't God something? You know, there was always a recognition of creation. So we have to integrate what we do, integrate what we do. Is spiritual resilience different? Thank you, Donna. From the power of resilience you referenced. They're connected. They're one and the same. Spiritual resilience speaks to the core of who we are, integrating all aspects of it, and the activation of that. The power of the activation of it comes through from spiritual resilience. So they are interchangeable. They're interconnected in many ways. What needs to, this is from Michael, what needs to occur, in your opinion, to expand and increase the wisdom of today's Black leaders that it relates to the challenges of AI? Oh, yes. And this techno-feudalist side. Thank you. How do we prepare and engage? We have to do teach-ins and workshops, and we have to bring in some of the brilliant experts who can really share with us about AI. For example, what many of us do not know is that because if you put some stuff in Chat GPT, you know, people think it's easy, this, that, and the other, that these companies are taking hold. For example, you say, I want to preach like Alfred Smith and Pastor Jacqueline Thompson. What these companies will do then, they will then take that name, they'll take some of the phrases, they'll take some of the information, and they will then copyright Jacqueline Thompson and J. Alfred Smith, and they will claim ownership over our community leaders' information. That's some of the part of the insidious nature of AI, is these, and that's again the idea of owning your data is important. The other aspect is in reference to there's a wonderful Black scholar, graduate of Spelman College, by the name of Ruha Benjamin. Ruha Benjamin is one of the experts in the field of technology and race. And what she has said is that the problem with technology, and you know, I was really taught by her reading her book, is that the technology is racist. They'll say it's not, but if the programmer is racist, AI will be racist. And here was the case. A company out in Silicon Valley, not too far from Allen Temple, created a soap dispenser. A soap dispenser that when you put your hand under it, it would dispense the soap because it wouldn't recognize a human hand over an animal hand, this, that, and the other. But because it was programmed by some white people, it didn't recognize hands that had melanin. So if you were Black, you ain't getting no soap. If you were white, you got some soap. And she used that as one of just the first examples, one of the first examples of how technology functions. Another is a few years ago when, if you Googled Black woman or Black girl, these horrific images would come up. If you Googled white woman or white girl, these very nice, you know, images would show up. This was not the truth. What was happening is because the way that Google functions, it's an aggregator. And because there are so many racists on the internet, the Google aggregator, because the more of them were on there than there were Black people, they were the AI system was picking up the images and the words that racists were using about Black people, Black women specifically. So the system then had an algorithm that framed Black women as, problematic, as, thieving. I mean, just all these terrible things. It's a book. I'm trying to think if it's sitting over here. It's kind of automated. It's autocracy. Automated autocracy is another one I'm trying to get through to really understand about technology. But again, the way the systems are structured. And so if you don't have Black people programming, Black people on the boards, you're going to end up with algorithms as of such. And if you don't have policies in place that recognize the power of a Google, for example, the cloud. We don't everybody think about the cloud. But there are only a few companies on the planet that store information. Now think about it now. Put everything in the cloud, meaning that someone holds our information. It's not like going to the bank. This is an undisclosed location, as they say, where they have control over your information, my information. Can those companies sift through our information? Yeah, they can. Potentially, they claim that they maybe not. But if we don't have the policies in place that make it a federal crime to do certain things or things that cannot be done, then companies will always choose capitalism over consciousness. That's what they do because they function in that realm. Thank you. That's a great question. Great question. We got to skip down a little bit. In your book, Deborah Lindsay, you said Jesus had the power to step down the cross, but he chose to stay. Will you please explain your conviction of this? I'm not sure about that. Well, thank you very much, Deborah. So here you have Jesus on the cross, Jesus who is later resurrected, Jesus who chooses to go to Calvary, and as Jesus being fully human and fully God, has the power to step down. The power of the cross is the choice that God has to be removed from that moment, but chooses not to. It's the withholding of power versus the utilization of that power. The same Jesus who resurrected Lazarus, the same Jesus who gave Bartimaeus sight, all of that chooses to stay. And I think firmly that the Bible, shares that argument, that perspective, and the fact that out of our tradition, the necessity for that moment. The power of history on our people. Oh, thank you, Carla. To take hold of Christ differently and not in an evangelical way. Absolutely, you can. See, the other thing is that evangelical, this is really interesting. Evangelical used to be the abolitionists in America. The evangelical movement shifts in 1954 when there was a Southern outrage around Brown versus Board of Education. That outrage was lifted up by a sermon by a person by the name of Jerry Falwell. Then from that moment, there was a move to private Christian schools because they didn't want to go to school with black people. And the evangelical movement moved away from its original roots of being democratic, of what was a revival movement. Everybody is welcome at the revival. We are anti-slave. We are interestingly enough, they were pro-labor. All of these things that were progressive, that's what the evangelicals were until 1954, when Southern evangelicals began a strong takeover. Evangelical is not the only way to practice a faith. Black people have been practicing a non-evangelical faith forever. And black people have been practicing a very different way. Fannie Lou Hamer would look you dead in the face and be like, evangelical, what are you talking about? I believe in Jesus. Black folk have been Jesus-centric. That's what it is. We're Jesus-centric. You can go to a black church and you can say what you want all day long. And when you're preaching, but say they hung him high and they stretched him wide. Oh, everybody, I know. There you go. Thank you, Reverend. You're preaching now. Because we're Jesus-centric, recognizing that the work, practice, and teaching of Jesus allows all human beings to flourish. Being Jesus-centric. And what's interesting is that millennials and Generation Z, they have a deep respect for Jesus. They just have issues with the church that doesn't reflect Jesus-centered faith. That's what they want to see. And we've got to return to a Jesus-centered faith. A Jesus-centered faith is the inaugural sermon. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach the good news to the poor. A Jesus-centric faith is concerned about those who have their backs against the wall, from those who don't have health care and those who are hurting, who have leprosy that people say are unclean. That is a Jesus-centric, centered faith. And the Black church, Martin Luther King Jr., the most well-known faith figure in the United States. But it's amazing to me now that people do not interrogate and look at him as a Jesus-centered faith leader. They have moved him and said, oh, he's a civil rights leader. No, he was a Jesus-centered person that was out of that faith tradition, said, I've got to do something about this undemocratic, destructive project of white supremacy that is antithetical to the message and teachings of Jesus. If you want to be dangerous, be a Jesus-centered person. If you want to be accepted, be a capitalist in ecclesiastical garments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moss. Look like we have run out of time. And it's too bad we won't be able to get to all the other questions that were there. Is there any way that you would like us to prepare for next week? Anything in particular you want us to focus on as we read the book?
Yes, definitely. We're going to hit chapter 1 next week. We're going to be doing Thurman. We're going to be talking about Thurman next week. If anyone has read any Thurman, Jesus the Disinherited, the Growing Edge, the Inward Journey, any of those pieces. So we'll be dealing with Thurman next week, and I'll be going into more depth about Dr. King.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone. If you have any questions of me, feel free to email me at cbfs@allen-temple.org. cbfs@allen-temple.org. All right. Have a good evening. What's left? Good night.